I hate to tell you how long ago that collegiate experience of mine was, and I want to assure you all that I'm used to having to talk to a lot of people during dinner, so don't feel at all restrained in terms of continuing to enjoy your meal. My husband and I are the parents of 7 children and now 6 grandchildren, so you know, we're used to a lot of hubbub during meals, and it kind of creates a certain coziness about a gathering. I am truly honored to have been asked to make some brief remarks this evening. And the weight of the responsibility rests with a sort of pleasing seriousness and heft upon my shoulders, because really what we witnessed earlier tonight was something quite special and extraordinary. A couple of nights ago, my mother and I decided to watch the movie The Martian in honor of NASA's recent landing of a probe successfully on Mars. Now, I don't know how many of you have seen the movie The Martian, but it tells the story of an astronaut who is mistakenly left behind on the planet Mars when the rest of his fellow mission specialists have to immediately evacuate. They believe that he is no longer alive, and they leave him behind. And most of the movie tells the story of his efforts to, as he puts it, sort of science the heck out of each new existential challenge that arises, because he is determined to live, to reconnect with NASA and his colleagues, and to somehow make it off that planet. But despite his most extraordinary efforts, sort of towards the end of the movie, he reaches a point where he recognizes just how dire his situation is, and that there is, in fact, a very high likelihood that he may not make it. So he leaves a message for his flight commander, asking if she would be willing to be the one to tell his parents if he doesn't make it. And what he asks her to tell them is that they should know that he died doing something he truly loved, something that was much bigger than himself. Somehow, as I was thinking about tonight, that scene kept playing through my mind. Although this incredibly lovely evening in this magnificent National Archives is quite different from the astronaut's grueling struggle for survival on a very inhospitable planet, tonight I feel strongly that each one of us has been privileged to be part of something we truly love, and something that is much, much bigger than any of us. We have placed our signatures or put our shoulders to the wheel behind a carefully and eloquently crafted charter that reaffirms our nation's and each of ours sacred commitment to protect and defend our cherished freedom of religion and conscience. Now, all of us in this room believe, probably with every fiber of our being, that religious liberty and freedom of conscience are vitally important, not only to our inherent dignity as human beings, but to building people and communities of character. And yet, and I think we need to acknowledge this, there are many who have begun to question that assumption and to question whether that is still true. And there are a lot of voices out there suggesting a counter-narrative, and I don't think those voices can be ignored. They would acknowledge and agree with us that the purpose of religious freedom is to give people the widest latitude to live out their lives according to the dictates of their own conscience. And of course, that sounds pretty good to all of us. But they would throw back, perhaps at us, the following question. What if their convictions, their pursuit, your pursuit of religious virtue leads towards intolerance, towards claims of religious supremacy, and yes, even in some tragic but not entirely infrequent instances towards religiously motivated violence. And we know that this is no mere idle speculation. We've already talked about the massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue and other terrible episodes that have happened in just the last few months in our country. And of course, if we look around the world, such events are far from uncommon. There are all too many people who are either motivated by radical religious extremism of their own or a radical religiously motivated hatred of others to commit unspeakable acts of violence in the name of their devotion to God. How can this be? Has it something to do with the nature of religion itself, or is it our human nature that is to blame? Religion, particularly religions based on revealed truth, like the three Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, make the highest and most audacious claims imaginable, namely, that the truths they teach have been imparted directly from God. That is the ultimate trump card, is it not? In the words of an old Texas preacher, it turns out everyone wants a theocracy and everyone wants to be Theo. And I think we all understand that's a huge problem. I am reminded of a freewheeling game of rock, paper, scissors that I observed two of my children playing many years ago when they were quite little. Now, how many of you have ever played rock, paper, scissors? Okay, I see most hands going up. It's a simple child's game. Your hands are behind your back. You count to 3, and on the count of 3, you bring out either a rock, a paper, or a scissor. And each one of those can trump the other. So if you pull out paper and the other pulls out rock, paper covers rock, and you win that round. If you pull out paper and somebody else pulls out scissors, scissor cuts paper. So that wins that round. And I think the last is that rock breaks scissor. So that's how you win that round. So it's sort of a fun game, but after a couple of rounds, it was starting to get a little boring. And so to kind of spice it up, they decided that they would allow each other to pull out anything from behind their back. And it got really lively at that point. There were cries of tigers and tanks and all sorts of imaginative things. And as you can guess, the arms race escalated with each round as the kids tried to outdo one another in coming up with unbeatable ordnance. Finally, it came to a climax as my daughter, who was a few years older, yelled, "Tsunami," with a triumphant look on her face. Meanwhile, my youngest son, Atticus, who was sitting opposite her, was just silently waving his arms back and forth like this. It was quite mesmerizing. Mystified, we asked him what that was supposed to represent, and he replied with a sufficiently impressive intonation, "God." Well, that was it. The game was over. There was nothing left to say, no more game to play. Now, in the realm of revealed religious truth, there is a danger that when adherents invoke God's revealed truth, they think that means the game is over. There's nothing left to discuss. Even more alarming, some may feel a duty to compel obedience to God's revelation by any means necessary, and they consider it an act of supreme virtue to do so. It makes me think of the chilling quote from Robespierre, he of the Reign of Terror in revolutionary France. He said, and I quote, "First comes virtue, and then its emanation, terror." Indeed. We are seeing this sort of religious radicalization now in many parts of the world, and it has certainly been seen many times in history. For example, during the period from 1618 to 1648, much of Europe was ravaged by the brutal 30 Years' War, which began as a religious war, and by some estimates led to 8 million deaths across the continent. And I'd like you to sort of wrap your head around that figure, considering the time of history we're talking about. The devastation was so great, so profound, that it prompted a radical new system of political order in Europe, referred to as the Peace of Westphalia, which established our modern concept of the sovereign state, as well as the small beginnings of a more tolerant attitude toward religious diversity. The Enlightenment accelerated this move by the West towards embracing a separate, individual, and, to some degree, subordinate role for religion in civil society, and with it, a more settled acceptance of religious tolerance and its companion, religious freedom. This was, I believe, most effectively and really extraordinarily achieved in the United States, with our historically unique and very bold idea to provide for both the separation of church and state and the unfettered free exercise of religion. And I would argue, and I think most of you would agree with this argument, that this extraordinary combination has been sort of the secret sauce that has made our great American experiment so successful. Thus, we can acknowledge that religion has enormous potential, as Reverend Rivers said earlier, to be a great tonic in society, building character and imparting virtue, and above all, giving meaning and direction to the lives of its adherents. But we can also acknowledge, and must in fairness acknowledge, that there is a risk implicit in the absolute truth claims of religion that can lead to intolerance and radicalization. So how do we ensure that religious freedom safeguards the conscience and convictions of all, but at the same time restrains the impulse of some to become enforcers of God's will on earth? How can we help religion to be, again quoting Reverend Rivers, a tonic, not a toxin in our body politic? I'd like to suggest a few answers, and of course, in this audience, you know all these answers anyway, but please bear with me. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, believed that religious pluralism was essential to protecting our civic rights. And if we accept this need for pluralism, it is perhaps the most powerful antidote to the dangers of absolutism. Voltaire said famously, "Where there is only one religion, tyranny rules. Where there are two, religious war reigns. But when there are many, liberty comes." Now, when we speak about defending freedom of religion, we must protect not just people's right to have their beliefs, but their right to access the public square, where ideas are exchanged and debated on the basis of equality and respect. Protecting religious freedom must mean defending the public arena itself. Our duty is not just to the players on the field, but to the turf. We also need to acknowledge that while broad accommodation should and indeed must be made for religious requirements that faith imposes on its adherents, sometimes religious practice will have to conform to our earthly laws and standards of justice, not because we place man's law above God's, but because we have the civic humility to recognize our own inadequacy in knowing how God would have his laws applied. And finally, perhaps the greatest protection we can offer to the rights of conscience is to embrace a civil and a spiritual theology that teaches that it is above all God's desire that his children should be free to choose for themselves. This profound, this sublime truth is there in the teachings of all the great faiths of the world, although at times it seems to be hidden in plain sight. It is there in the Quran, which instructs that there is to be no compulsion in religion. It is there in both the Old and New Testaments. And if we go through the writings and the teachings and the holy texts of almost every faith, we find it there. And tonight, we can say that it rings out on every page of the magnificent charter that we have signed this very evening. I'd like to close my remarks today with a short story that I think beautifully illustrates the profound connection between religious freedom and all the other precious rights that we as Americans cherish, and underscores that actualizing those rights depends on each of our individual right to seek truth for ourselves. John Wycliffe, the English philosopher, theologian, reformer, and preacher, undertook to translate the Bible from the Latin Vulgate into the common vernacular in the late 1300s. And he did so in the face of enormous opposition and even persecution from the ecclesiastical authorities of his day. Despite all, he persisted in this mission. And when his work was done, he wrote the following words in the flyleaf of that first Bible. "The translation is complete and shall make possible government of the people, by the people, and for the people." Now, most of us here in this room associate those immortal words with President Lincoln and the occasion of the Gettysburg Address, but they have a more ancient patrimony. We cannot know precisely what Wycliffe meant when he wrote those words, but I believe he was illuminating for all of us the profound insight that when men and women are free to pursue and understand truth for themselves without compulsion, they become empowered to build societies that honor the claims of conscience and the fundamental liberties of all people. It is my hope and my prayer that this magnificent American charter that we inaugurate and sign this evening will be the means of extending that blessing, not only now to our fellow Americans, but to people around the world. Thank you so much.